Ajani stood at the edge of the stage, feeling the cool breeze of the fan as it blew through his hair. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the anticipation. He was about to step into the spotlight in front of an audience that would determine the course of his life. He was used to the sound of people murmuring and whispering around him. He had learned to tune out the distractions long ago. But today, the whispers weren't just from people talking about his blindness, they were whispers of doubt. Whispers of a boy who had no place being here, no business trying to prove himself among the best. Ajani couldn't see, but he could feel the stares. The weight of those stares pressed against him like a brick wall, suffocating him. He could hear the laughter in the background too, the mocking laughter of someone who had no idea what it was like to face the world through his eyes, or lack thereof. His fingers tightened around the neck of his guitar, the cool wood offering a sense of comfort, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He had trained for this. He had fought for this moment. But today, the doubts felt heavier than ever. "Go on, kid. Show us what you've got," came a voice from the shadows, cutting through the noise. Ajani froze, recognizing the voice instantly. It was Jackson Cole, the legendary guitarist who had made his name shredding on stages worldwide. The man who had the kind of reputation that could either make or break a career with a single word. And Jackson's words were never kind to those who didn't fit his idea of what a musician should be. Ajani's fingers trembled slightly. He had heard the rumors, the stories about Jackson. About how he looked down on anyone he considered inferior. About how he wasn't afraid to say exactly what he thought, no matter how brutal it was. And now, here he was, standing just a few feet away, ready to judge him. But there was something deeper, a gnawing feeling, a mix of anger and determination, that pushed Ajani forward. He wasn't here to please anyone. He was here because this was the one place where he could truly belong. No matter what Jackson or anyone else thought. He swallowed the lump in his throat and took a deep breath, grounding himself. He had learned to tune out the noise. To shut out the world and focus on the one thing that mattered, his music. And today, that music was all he had. He stepped onto the stage, his feet moving carefully, but with purpose. His guitar was in his hands, but he didn't need to see it to know its weight. He had spent countless hours with it, learning its every curve, its every string. It was his voice, his expression, his connection to a world that had so often rejected him. As the spotlight hit him, he could feel the heat on his skin, but his focus remained on the strings of his guitar. He could hear the faint sound of the audience settling, the rustle of programs and shifting seats. But in his world, it was quiet. Just him and the music. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the guitar fill his senses. Then, he began to play. The first few notes were soft, deliberate, as his fingers danced across the strings with precision. It was a simple melody at first, but it was his. His heart poured into it, the rhythm a reflection of his struggles, his dreams, his fears. It was more than just music, it was a message, a story. But then, as the music built, so did the tension. The room seemed to close in on him, and in the distance, he heard a voice. A voice that cut through the music like a knife. "Is that it?" the voice sneered. "A blind kid trying to play guitar like he's got a chance. You're wasting everyone's time." The voice belonged to Jackson Cole. Ajani's fingers faltered for a moment. His heart skipped a beat, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He could already feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fail. He had always known that being a young, blind, black boy trying to make it in the world of music would be difficult. But today, the weight of that knowledge hit him harder than ever. He had grown up in a world where he was told over and over again that he didn't belong. Where people saw his blindness as a limitation and his race as a hurdle to overcome. But Ajani was determined. He wasn't just playing to prove something to Jackson or anyone else. He was playing for himself, for the kid who had spent countless hours in his room, strumming his guitar and imagining what it would be like to stand on a stage like this one. So, despite the sting of Jackson's words, Ajani pressed on. The music became his shield, his armor against the world. The notes swirled around him like a storm, rising and falling with intensity. His fingers moved faster now, each chord, each strum, a defiant declaration. He could hear the whispers around him intensify, but he didn't care. He focused only on the music, letting it pour out of him. He played not just the melody, but the feelings he had kept locked inside for so long. The hurt, the anger, the longing for acceptance. His music was the only way he could make the world hear him. His fingers became a blur, each note a story he needed to tell. And then, as if on cue, the room fell silent. Ajani took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the silence settle on him like a heavy blanket. The music had stopped, but the energy in the room hung in the air, charged with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke. Ajani stood there, his guitar resting in his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, Jackson spoke again, but this time, his tone was different. Gone was the mocking sneer, replaced by a begrudging respect. "Kid," Jackson said, his voice softer now, "you've got something. I'll give you that." Ajani stood still, unsure if he had heard correctly. But he knew that this was only the beginning. He had proven something today, not just to Jackson, but to himself. This was his moment. And no matter what came next, he was ready for it. As he stepped off the stage, his heart still racing, a strange mix of emotions washed over him. The fear, the doubt, the feeling of being an outsider, they were still there. But for the first time, they felt a little more distant. For the first time, Ajani felt like he was truly seen. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, he thought to himself, even though the only audience around him was the sound of his own heartbeat and the faint hum of the guitar's strings. This moment, this first step, might just spark a new beginning. Ajani didn't sleep much that night. The words Jackson Cole had said to him echoed in his mind over and over, a looping soundtrack that neither comforted nor discouraged him. They had been simple words, but they had been the first spark of acknowledgement he'd ever received from someone who wasn't afraid to speak their mind. In his small, modest room, filled with nothing but the soft hum of his guitar resting against the wall and the faint glow of the streetlights outside, Ajani lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to process it all. He had always known that music would be his escape. His passion for it had begun as a young boy, long before the world had started whispering that a blind black kid could never make it in an industry dominated by images of perfection, fame, and talent. But it wasn't the industry that had drawn him in, it was the guitar itself. Ajani's love for music was woven into his very fabric. When he was 5, his father, a jazz musician, had introduced him to the guitar. Though his vision had been impaired from birth, Ajani had a heightened sense of hearing, a gift that he had honed over the years. He could listen to the hum of a guitar string, and just by the tone, he could tell what kind of wood had been used to build it, or how tight or loose the strings were stretched. His dad had always told him that the key to great music wasn't just in the fingers, it was in the heart. But Ajani's heart had been tested long before Jackson Cole's sneering comments. Growing up in the rougher parts of Atlanta hadn't been easy, especially as a kid who couldn't see. He could hear the world, yes, its laughter, its anger, its music, but he couldn't see it. And sometimes, that had felt like the greatest loss of all. In a world that valued image and appearances above all else, Ajani had often felt like an outsider. Not just because of his blindness, but because of the color of his skin. Despite the hurdles, Ajani never allowed the whispers and mocking comments to get to him. He had his family, his mother, his younger sister, who always made sure that his world was filled with love and warmth. His mom was a constant source of strength, telling him every day that he could be anything he wanted to be, no matter the challenges he faced. Ajani, his mom had always said, your eyes may not work the way others do, but your heart is sharper than anyone else's. That's what will guide you. But what if his heart wasn't enough? What if no matter how hard he worked, the world would always see him as less than, always a boy, always black, always blind. What if Jackson Cole was right? As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracks in the blinds, Johnny sat up in bed and reached for his guitar. The cool, familiar wood felt comforting under his fingertips. He strummed a chord, letting the sound fill the space around him. He closed his eyes and focused on the vibrations, the deep hum of the strings, and the connection he felt to the world through the music. It was time to push forward, no matter the obstacles. The next day, Johnny decided to go back to the venue. Jackson had made a point of letting him know that the audition was just the beginning. That there were bigger things at play. So, Johnny, ever the optimist, saw this as a chance to prove to the world that he wasn't just a boy with a guitar. He was a musician. When he arrived at the venue, he noticed the small crowd that had gathered outside. He recognized a few faces from the night before, people who had watched his performance but hadn't stayed long enough to witness the aftermath. Johnny figured they had probably thought he was a novelty, another feel-good story of an underdog trying to rise against all odds. Walking past the group, he heard snippets of conversation. "Do you think he'll actually make it? Come on, he's blind. How could he even keep up with the other players? He's got a lot of heart, though, but I don't know, man." Johnny's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let the words get to him. Instead, he squared his shoulders and walked through the doors of the building. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Musicians of all kinds were gathered in the lobby, tuning their instruments and chatting nervously about the opportunity they were about to face. Some were seasoned professionals, others were aspiring stars. And there, in the corner, was Jackson Cole, looking as unbothered as ever. The moment Jackson saw Johnny, he lifted an eyebrow, as if he hadn't expected him to return. Well. Didn't think I'd see you back here. What's your plan, kid? Gonna blow us all away again?" Jackson's tone wasn't cruel this time, but it still held a challenge. Johnny stood tall, forcing his voice to be steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Mr. Cole. I'm here to prove to myself that I belong." Jackson studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. Then, to Johnny's surprise, the legendary guitarist gave a small nod. "Fair enough. Let's see what you've got." Johnny felt a rush of determination flood through him. This was his moment. It didn't matter that Jackson didn't believe in him, or that the world had already decided who he was based on his blindness and the color of his skin. He would show them all, through his music, that he was more than what they thought. As he walked past Jackson, the eyes of the other musicians on him felt heavier than before. But instead of faltering, Johnny raised his head high. He moved to the side of the stage where the equipment had been set up for rehearsals. As he ran his fingers over the strings of his guitar, he focused on the sound, the vibrations in the air. This was where he belonged. The band members were setting up, tuning their instruments, laughing amongst themselves, but Johnny could sense the skepticism in the air. No one had said a word to him, and he didn't expect them to. In a way, their silence was louder than any insult could have been. But he was ready. His fingers found the strings again, and as he played, the music filled the space. It didn't matter if anyone understood it yet, it was his music, and it was the language he had spoken his whole life. He played, his heart full of emotion, of all the trials he'd faced, of all the obstacles he had overcome. It was more than just notes and rhythms. It was his truth, his story. And this time, as the music poured out of him, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he felt lighter. It was as if he was flying, floating above all the doubt, all the expectations. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson Cole and everyone else would see him for what he truly was, a musician with a soul too big for anyone to ignore. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Johnny. The world he once knew, a world of dimly lit rooms and quiet corners, was suddenly becoming larger, louder, and more intimidating. But in all the chaos, one thing was clear, he wasn't going to back down. The memory of the crowd's skeptical stares, Jackson Cole's indifferent challenge, and the throbbing weight of doubt hanging in the air only fueled his determination. Every evening after school, Johnny returned to the small studio space his mother had helped set up in the corner of their apartment. His guitar, weathered but well-loved, was always by his side. Here, in the solitude of his room, the noise of the outside world faded away. It was just him and the music. But it wasn't just practice that consumed his thoughts. The reality of what he was about to face, what he had already started facing, had begun to hit him harder than he had anticipated. Jackson Cole's challenge was just the beginning, and he had no illusion that the road ahead would be easy. Even if he managed to impress Jackson, even if he played the guitar better than anyone else, it wasn't going to be enough. He knew that. Being a blind black boy with a guitar wasn't something most people were ready to embrace. It wasn't something they understood. Johnny had heard the whispered comments behind his back, the quiet doubts about his place in a world that prioritized appearance and perfection. There were other kids in the audition, more traditionally talented, with flawless techniques and polished performances. They didn't have to prove themselves to anyone. They were the ideal, the kind of people who seemed to have everything handed to them just by showing up. But Johnny wasn't them. For all his talent and heart, Johnny knew that his story would always be different. He would always have to work harder, push farther, and climb higher just to be seen. And that was exhausting. But his mother's voice echoed in his head, always reminding him, "You are more than what people see." He hadn't realized how much he needed that reminder until now. The following Monday, after another long day of school, Johnny made his way to the venue once again, guitar slung over his back. This time, there was a buzz in the air. Word had spread about the blind black kid who had dared to step onto the stage and play in front of Jackson Cole. The whispers were louder now, but they weren't just of doubt. Some were impressed, some were curious, but most, if they were honest, were skeptical. "I heard he's blind, man. Like, how is he even supposed to play guitar?" "I don't know, but I heard he played something last time that wasn't half bad." "Half bad?" A laugh. "That's a hell of a compliment." Johnny tried to ignore the voices as he pushed through the door, the faint sting of their words lingering, but he didn't let it stop him. He had work to do. He had a purpose. This was about more than just showing the world that he could play, it was about showing them that music was universal, that it transcended sight, color, and the limitations that others tried to impose on him. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The rehearsal room was buzzing with the sounds of tuning instruments, chatting musicians, and the occasional burst of laughter. But among the crowd, he could feel the tension. He wasn't the only one trying to stand out. Everyone here had something to prove, and that made him both nervous and determined. As Johnny moved to the side, preparing to plug in his guitar, he noticed Jackson sitting off to the side, talking to a group of other musicians. The man was as imposing as ever, with his long, graying hair and his sharp, calculating eyes. Johnny had heard stories of Jackson's success, of how he had taken the music world by storm with his raw, unapologetic style. But Johnny also knew the darker side, the side that people rarely saw. Jackson wasn't a man who handed out praise easily. Johnny's palms were slick with sweat as he took a deep breath and plugged in his guitar. The room was filled with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation, but Johnny refused to let that affect him. His fingers brushed the strings, finding their place, and the familiar vibration sent a surge of calm through him. This was where he belonged. He tuned up quickly, his ears absorbing the changes in pitch as he adjusted each string. He wasn't here to compete with the other musicians, at least not in the way they thought. He wasn't trying to impress them, not in the way they were used to being impressed. He was here to share a part of himself. As he looked up, he saw Jackson watching him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to gauge his every move. Johnny didn't look away. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to prove himself, and this time, it was more than just about his skills, it was about showing everyone that his blindness didn't limit him. It was about showing them the fire inside of him, the drive that burned brighter than the doubt they had. "Whenever you're ready, kid," Jackson called from across the room, his voice sharp but not unkind. Johnny took one last breath and began to play. The first few notes rang out into the room, and Johnny felt the weight of the world lifting, if only for a moment. He wasn't just playing for Jackson. He wasn't just playing for the skeptical audience of musicians. He was playing for every doubt, every mockery, every silent judgment that had ever been cast on him. Each note was a challenge, each chord an answer to the question of whether he belonged. His fingers flew across the strings with a fluidity that surprised even him. The melody was raw, emotional, something deep and personal. It wasn't just a song, it was his heart laid bare for the world to hear. As the music filled the room, Johnny could feel the shift in energy. The musicians stopped talking, their attention moving toward him. Even Jackson, who had seemed so aloof earlier, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Johnny as if hearing him for the first time. The room had grown quiet, save for the sound of the guitar, the sweet, soulful tones that filled the space. Johnny played with everything he had. He played with the intensity of a person who had something to prove and with the grace of someone who had nothing to lose. His emotions poured through every note, each string vibrating with the weight of his story. His life. His truth. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt longer than it actually was. The room was still. Johnny set his guitar down, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't need to look around to know the impact he had made. The room had shifted. He could feel it. After what seemed like an eternity, Jackson stood up, slowly clapping his hands together. It was slow at first, hesitant. But then, the claps grew louder. The rest of the musicians joined in, their applause growing as they recognized the raw talent that had just filled the room. Jackson gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that told Johnny everything he needed to know. "Kid," Jackson said, his voice low but filled with a grudging respect. That was something else. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected applause. He hadn't expected any kind of validation, but here it was. The recognition. The acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he did belong. He wasn't sure what came next, but in that moment, he felt something shift inside of him. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The days that followed Johnny's performance at the venue seemed to blur together. The initial rush of adrenaline from his performance had faded, but the lingering feeling of validation, that deep, resonant understanding that he was capable of more than he had ever believed, remained. Yet, as much as that moment felt like a victory, it also marked the beginning of something far more daunting. Johnny was beginning to understand that the world he was stepping into wasn't as simple as proving he could play the guitar. It wasn't about playing the right notes or hitting the perfect rhythm. It was about carving out a place for himself in an industry that was quick to judge, slow to accept, and even slower to understand people who didn't fit the mold. It wasn't just Jackson Cole he had to impress anymore. It wasn't just the small crowd of musicians in the room that day. Johnny had bigger dreams, dreams of standing on stages, of having his music heard across the world. But even with his talent, those dreams were tangled in layers of doubt, stereotypes, and expectations that seemed impossible to shed. Each day, Johnny spent hours in his room, his fingers flying across the strings, honing his craft. But now, the stakes were higher. He wasn't just playing for the joy of it anymore. He wasn't just playing to prove something to himself. Now, he was playing for a future where he could find a way to break through the barriers he had spent his whole life navigating. On Tuesday, he met with Jackson again. This time, it was different. There was a more formal tone to the meeting, something businesslike. It was clear that Jackson had been considering his performance more than he had let on. Johnny, Jackson said as he sat across from him, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You've got something. I'll give you that. But the question is, what are you going to do with it?" Johnny sat still, his palms sweating a little. He had heard this kind of talk before, that "you've got potential, but..." speech. It was the kind of thing people said when they didn't know whether to give you a chance or dismiss you outright. Jackson's gaze never wavered. "You're blind. You're black. That's something the world's gonna throw in your face every chance it gets. People won't take you seriously. You've got to be better than everyone else. And then you've got to be better than that. Do you understand?" Johnny nodded, his stomach nodding. "I get it. You're not just fighting to be a musician," Jackson continued. "You're fighting to be seen. And that's a whole different battle." It wasn't just Jackson's words that struck Johnny, it was the weight behind them. Jackson wasn't offering him a handout or a shortcut. He was preparing him for the hard road ahead. A road that would test him in ways he couldn't even imagine. That evening, as Johnny walked home from the meeting, his mind was buzzing with the conversation. He had never thought about it in such blunt terms. Sure, he had been told that life wouldn't be easy for him, but Jackson's words hit deeper than anything his mother or his friends had ever said. He had always known that the world wasn't going to hand him anything. He had always known that he would have to work harder than others, and that the odds would be stacked against him. But hearing Jackson's candid truth was like a wake-up call. The world wasn't just going to be indifferent to him. It was going to be hostile. As he entered his apartment, his mother greeted him with a warm smile, but her eyes softened as she saw the look on his face. "Hey, baby. How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Johnny hesitated for a moment before answering. "It went well, in a way. Jackson said I have potential, but I have to be prepared for the challenges ahead. He said the world won't take me seriously. That I have to be better than everyone else. And then better than that." His mother's smile faltered, but she didn't look surprised. She had always known how hard Johnny's journey would be. But she also knew that he had something special. Something that no one could take away from him. "You're better than you think, Johnny," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "But no one said the road would be easy. What you have to remember is that no one can define your worth. Only you can do that. And as long as you keep believing in yourself, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks." Johnny hugged her back, the weight of the conversation still heavy on his mind. She was right, of course. But the road ahead felt uncertain. Jackson's words were a constant echo in his thoughts. He had to be more than just a musician, he had to be a symbol. He had to prove something that no one had asked him to prove. The next few weeks became a blur of rehearsals, performances, and quiet moments of reflection. Every day, Johnny spent hours with his guitar, practicing, refining, pushing himself. But even with the music as his anchor, the pressure was starting to get to him. He felt like he was constantly performing, constantly having to prove himself in ways that no one else had to. There were times when the exhaustion hit him hard. The weight of expectations, both his own and those from the world around him, felt unbearable. There were nights when he would sit in his room, guitar in hand, and wonder if it was all worth it. But every time that doubt crept in, something pulled him back. His mother's voice, the image of Jackson's silent approval after his performance, and the flicker of something inside him that refused to quit. No matter how tough it got, he wasn't going to give up. Music wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. And maybe that was the key. It wasn't about fitting into a mold or meeting someone's expectations. It was about playing with his whole heart, showing the world that his music mattered, even if they didn't understand him. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Johnny received a call from Jackson. His heart skipped a beat as he picked up the phone, unsure of what to expect. "Johnny," Jackson's voice came through the receiver, sounding more serious than usual. "I've got something for you. We've got a chance to perform at a small gig. It's not huge, but it's a start. A real one. You in?" Johnny didn't hesitate. "Yes. I'm in." "Good," Jackson said, his tone finally softening. This is it. You're about to step into something real. Just remember, the road's gonna be rough. But if you keep pushing, you'll make it. Johnny exhaled, feeling a surge of anticipation rise within him. This was it. The first step toward something bigger. The first real opportunity. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready. The days leading up to the gig felt like a blur of anticipation and pressure. Johnny could barely focus on anything other than the performance. The world outside seemed to fade as he focused on the one thing that kept him grounded: his guitar. Each string was like a lifeline, each chord a piece of his identity that he hoped the world would finally understand. The gig Jackson had mentioned was a small one, but it felt like a giant step. For the first time in a long time, Johnny felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the pieces were starting to fall into place. His rehearsals were intense. He spent every free moment with his guitar, refining every note, every chord, every rhythm. There were times when his fingers ached, when the frustration of getting it just right seemed almost too much to bear. But Johnny pushed through. He had no choice. In the quiet moments, when he wasn't playing, his mind wandered back to his mother's words, the ones that had been echoing in his head ever since Jackson's blunt advice: no one can define your worth. Only you can do that. At school, he felt the pressure too. The whispers hadn't stopped. Johnny had learned to tune them out, to keep his head down and his focus sharp. He didn't need their approval anymore. The people who doubted him were always going to be there, but he was learning to ignore them. He was starting to believe in himself more, to trust in the music that flowed from his fingers. The night before the gig, he sat on his bed, his guitar resting against his legs. He hadn't practiced for hours like he normally did. Instead, he just let his fingers idly strum a few simple chords. The melodies felt easier now, more natural. It wasn't about the perfection of each note anymore, it was about the feeling behind it. The music had become a part of him. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself. Tomorrow is my chance. The day of the gig arrived, and the nerves hit him like a freight train. It was a small venue, tucked away in a corner of the city he hadn't really explored before. The kind of place where the walls were covered in posters of local bands, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat and spilled beer. Not exactly the glamorous debut he had once imagined, but it didn't matter. He wasn't in it for the glamour. He was in it to show the world who he was. Jackson had told him to show up early to get familiar with the space, and when Johnny arrived, he was greeted by the sound of a few other musicians tuning their instruments and chatting amongst themselves. The room was dimly lit, with a small stage at the front, and a scattering of empty chairs for the audience. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Johnny's palms were slick with sweat as he made his way to the corner where he could tune his guitar. His nerves were starting to get the best of him. It felt like every ounce of doubt he had ever carried was suddenly rushing back in full force. What if he messed up? What if they couldn't look past his blindness or his race long enough to appreciate the music? What if Jackson was wrong? But then he remembered the feel of his guitar in his hands, the way the strings hummed with life under his fingertips. He couldn't let the fear take over. This was his moment. As he tuned his guitar, he could hear snippets of conversation from the other musicians. They didn't seem to notice him at first, too busy with their own preparations. But that would change soon enough. Jackson had said the gig would be a good opportunity to introduce him to the scene, to let him make a name for himself, however small. The world had to start somewhere, right? Jackson eventually appeared, standing by the door with his arms crossed. He gave Johnny a nod of approval, his face unreadable. "You ready?" Jackson asked, his voice low. Johnny nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. I think so." "Good. This is your chance. Don't hold back." Jackson paused, looking at him closely. "And remember, this is about you. No one else. You play for you. Johnny took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Jackson's words sink in. This wasn't just about the gig. This was about claiming his space in a world that had been hesitant to make room for him. He was going to give it everything he had. The show started, and one by one, the other musicians took the stage. Johnny sat in the back, listening as they played their sets. Some were good, some were great, but none of them struck him the way his music did. It wasn't that their playing was bad, it was just that their music didn't have the same fire, the same urgency. Johnny's music came from a different place, one that wasn't interested in perfection but in expression. As he waited for his turn, Johnny's nerves returned in full force. His fingers tapped nervously against the side of his guitar case, his mind running through every possible mistake he could make. But then he closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to push the fear away. The sound of the guitar, the pull of the strings, it was what grounded him. It was what had always grounded him. When it was finally his turn, he stood up, gripping his guitar tightly. The room felt smaller than it had earlier, the eyes of the audience sharp and expectant. He could hear their whispers, their doubt, their curiosity. But it didn't matter. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He wasn't here to win their approval. He was here to be heard. As he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight hit him. It felt warmer than he expected, almost comforting, as if the world had narrowed its focus down to just him and his guitar. He could hear the faint rustling of chairs, the shuffling of feet, but he didn't let it distract him. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle over him like a blanket. And then he began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, as his fingers gently brushed the strings. But soon, the melody began to grow stronger. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Every chord, every note, told a piece of his story, his truth. His fingers moved with a fluidity that felt natural, as if the guitar had always been a part of him, like an extension of his soul. The room grew quieter, the noise from the audience fading into the background as the music took over. He played like he had something to prove, and yet, at the same time, like he had nothing to lose. It wasn't about the audience. It was about the music, about sharing something that was uniquely his. When the last note finally rang out, Johnny stood there for a moment, eyes closed, listening to the echo of his guitar. The room was silent, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with the weight of what he had just shared. And then, slowly, the applause started. At first, it was hesitant, unsure. But as the seconds passed, the applause grew louder, stronger. Johnny didn't move, didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to see it to know that he had done it. He had stood on that stage and poured everything into his music. And it had resonated. Jackson was clapping too, a small but approving smile on his face. Johnny's heart swelled as he felt the support surrounding him. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a significant step forward. Johnny's performance at the small venue left him with a rush of emotions he didn't know how to process. When the applause had finally faded, the weight of the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he'd experienced before. For the first time in his life, Johnny felt as though he had truly been seen. Not as a blind boy, not as a black boy, but as a musician. For a brief moment, it was as if the world had just listened to his soul speak. The next morning, however, the magic of the night before was replaced by an unsettling sense of doubt. He sat on the edge of his bed, guitar in hand, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. His mother was at work, leaving him with the stillness of the apartment and the whirlwind of thoughts that had taken over his mind. The gig had been a success, in a way. The crowd had appreciated his music, even if it was just a handful of people who seemed genuinely moved. But it was Jackson's words that kept replaying in his head. You've got to be better than everyone else. And then you've got to be better than that. Johnny's fingers hovered over the strings, but he couldn't bring himself to play. He wasn't sure if he was good enough. Was he really ready for the bigger stage? Was he truly capable of taking his music beyond the small, familiar spaces he had grown used to? He had spent so much of his life battling the limitations that others placed on him, but now, the hardest battle was the one inside his own mind. The battle between self-doubt and the fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. Later that day, Jackson called him. The tone in his voice was businesslike, but there was a hint of something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. Johnny," Jackson said after a brief greeting. "I've been thinking about the gig. You did good, kid. Better than good. But now, we need to talk about your next move." Johnny's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected a follow-up conversation so soon. "Next move," he repeated, trying to sound calm despite the anxiety creeping up his spine. "The next step is bigger. There's a chance for you to open for a local band at a larger venue. It's a bigger crowd, more exposure. But you need to be ready." Johnny felt a lump form in his throat. A larger venue? He'd barely gotten through the last performance, and now he was being asked to step up to something even bigger. "I don't know if I'm ready," Johnny admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I mean, last night, that was a small crowd. What if I mess up in front of more people? What if they don't like me?" Jackson was silent for a moment, as if considering his response. Then, he spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Johnny. I'm asking you to keep pushing. To keep proving that you deserve to be here, even when things get tough. You've got the talent. That's undeniable. Now it's about how bad you want it." Johnny exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the neck of his guitar. Jackson's words didn't make the fear go away, but they stirred something else within him, a sense of determination he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about fighting for a place in a world that wasn't ready for him, a world that might never fully accept him. But that didn't matter. What mattered was his ability to keep going, to keep fighting, no matter the obstacles. "I'll do it," Johnny said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm in." Jackson chuckled, a small sound of approval. "Good. I knew you would be. We'll work out the details soon. Just make sure you're ready. This is your chance." As the conversation ended, Johnny leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what he had just agreed to was starting to sink in. A larger venue, a bigger crowd, more eyes watching him. His nerves surged, but so did his resolve. This was the next step. He couldn't afford to back down now. In the days that followed, Johnny poured himself into his practice. Every free moment was spent playing, refining his skills, making sure that every note, every chord, was as perfect as he could make it. He knew the stakes had been raised, and the pressure was mounting. But despite the fear gnawing at him, he felt something else, a fire inside that burned brighter with every passing day. He wasn't just practicing for the next gig. He was practicing for his future. For everything he had dreamed of, everything he had worked for. And though he still didn't know if he was truly ready, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let fear stop him now. But even as Johnny prepared for the next stage in his journey, the battle within him raged on. He was still unsure of what the world would think of him. What would they say when he stepped on that stage? Would they see the black, blind kid who somehow managed to pick up a guitar and make it sing? Or would they see just another person who didn't fit the mold, someone who wasn't worthy of their attention? Johnny tried not to think about it. He focused on the music, on the sound that came from his hands, on the way his guitar felt like a part of him. But it was hard to shut out the world, especially when the world kept reminding him that he didn't belong. One night, as he sat in his room, guitar resting on his lap, his mother came in and sat beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him as he strummed softly, lost in his thoughts. "You know," she said eventually, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about something. You've been practicing so hard, but I wonder if you're forgetting something." Johnny stopped playing and looked at her, brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? You've been so focused on proving yourself to others. But have you thought about proving something to yourself? Ajani's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? His mother smiled gently. You don't have to convince anyone that you're worthy of a chance. You don't need their approval to be who you are. The only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. You've already done that by picking up that guitar, by playing your heart out. Everything after that is just icing on the cake. Ajani thought about her words for a long time after she left. He realized that, in his quest for approval, he had forgotten the most important thing, his own worth. He had the music. He had the passion. And that, he realized, was enough. The days leading up to the new gig felt like an eternity. As much as Ajani tried to focus on practicing, every moment was consumed by the uncertainty gnawing at him. The larger venue Jackson had mentioned was a far cry from the small club he had played in before. This was bigger, with real headliners, and Ajani was only opening. A part of him was thrilled, the other part terrified. He had practiced non-stop, playing in his room, in the kitchen, on the balcony, wherever he could find space. But no matter how much he rehearsed, he couldn't shake the thought that the bigger crowd would see him not as a musician but as a blind kid trying to play guitar. The thought of the audience judging him based on his blindness or his race instead of his music haunted him every time he picked up his guitar. The city was colder now, fall settling in with a crispness that seemed to match Ajani's mood. The leaves were turning shades of orange and yellow, but the beauty of it all seemed distant, as if a fog had rolled in and covered the world. Ajani couldn't escape the pressure that weighed on him. You've got this, Ajani, Jackson had said during their last practice session, his voice full of confidence. I've seen it in you, and I know you're going to blow them away. But despite Jackson's faith in him, Ajani still felt the heavy weight of doubt press down on him. The night of the gig arrived. The venue was much larger than he had imagined. It was called the Rhythm House, a place with a reputation for hosting well-known acts. The walls of the venue were adorned with posters of musicians who had graced the stage, some famous, others still climbing. The air was thick with the buzz of anticipation, the sound of voices blending into a distant hum as people chatted and waited for the music to start. Ajani walked into the backstage area, his heart pounding in his chest. He had arrived early to get the feel of the place, and now that he was backstage, he was beginning to feel the weight of what he had signed up for. This was real. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. He could hear the sounds of the other bands warming up in the distance, guitar riffs, drum beats, and the occasional voice shouting over the noise. The sound of their music mixed with his own nervous heartbeat. It was as if the whole world had drawn in a collective breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Jackson was nearby, giving last-minute instructions to a few of the other performers. He looked over at Ajani and nodded encouragingly. Just breathe, Ajani. You've got this, Jackson said, his voice full of determination. Ajani didn't respond. He could feel his hands trembling, a mix of excitement and fear flooding him. The stage ahead seemed impossibly huge, and for the first time in a long while, he felt small. The fear of messing up in front of so many people, people who would likely judge him based on things he couldn't control, was overwhelming. A young woman who was one of the event organizers walked up to him, clipboard in hand. Ajani, right? You're up in 20 minutes, she said with a professional smile. Yeah, that's me, Ajani responded, his voice shaky. Is there anything I need to do before going on? She gave him a quick once-over, and her smile grew a little wider. Nope, just get ready. We'll make sure everything's set up for you. You're good to go. Ajani nodded, his stomach churning as he turned away. He found a quiet corner in the backstage area, away from the hustle and bustle. Sitting down, he closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing thoughts. What was he so afraid of? This wasn't just about him proving something to the world, it was about his music. He had the talent. He had the heart. He wasn't a blind boy playing guitar, he was a musician, a creator of sound, someone with a story to tell. But still, doubt lingered in the back of his mind. What if the world didn't hear his story the way he intended? What if they only saw his blindness or his skin and decided that was all they needed to know about him? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Johnny?" Jackson's voice called from the other side. "You ready?" Johnny took a deep breath. "Yeah. I think so." As he walked toward the stage, the noise of the crowd became louder, the vibrations of the bass from the main act's soundcheck traveling through the floor. The lights from the stage were blinding, and Johnny squinted as he adjusted to the new environment. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the audience and the sound of glasses clinking together. His hands began to sweat as he gripped his guitar. Jackson gave him one last encouraging smile before he disappeared behind the curtains, leaving Johnny alone on stage. Johnny took a few more deep breaths, his hands pressing against the strings for a moment, feeling the familiar hum beneath his fingertips. The moment felt so surreal, so much bigger than he had ever imagined. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but there was something else too, a spark of fire, a pull that urged him forward, despite the fear. The lights on the stage dimmed for a moment, and then a voice came over the speakers, announcing his name. "Next up, Johnny Black." The crowd's response was a mixture of claps and scattered applause. Johnny couldn't help but wonder if they were expecting something special, or if they were just curious about the blind black kid with a guitar. It didn't matter, though. He couldn't control their expectations. He could only control what he did next. With one final deep breath, Johnny stepped forward into the spotlight. He could feel the heat from the stage lights on his face, but he kept his eyes closed, blocking out everything but the music. The world outside of his mind faded as he strummed the first chord. The music came to him easily. The melody that flowed from his hands felt like it was born from the very air around him. The crowd, still a blur of sound, began to fade away as he lost himself in the rhythm, in the story his guitar was telling. The fear, the doubt, it all disappeared. There was only the music. And in that moment, the world outside didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, doing what he was born to do. Johnny let go completely, his fingers moving fluidly over the strings, creating a melody that was soulful and full of energy. His body moved with the music as the room seemed to breathe with him. He felt the vibration of every note in his bones, his heart syncing with the pulse of the guitar. The audience, once unsure, now responded, clapping, nodding along to the rhythm. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it didn't matter. They were listening. They were hearing him. As he played, he realized something that he hadn't fully grasped until now: the power of the music wasn't just in the sound, but in how it connected people. He could reach them, even if they didn't understand everything about him. The set was short, only about 15 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. And when the last chord rang out, Johnny opened his eyes to see the audience's reaction. The applause was louder now, more genuine, and Johnny stood still for a moment, soaking it all in. They had heard him. They had listened. Johnny's hands trembled as he stepped off the stage. He was still in a daze, his body buzzing from the adrenaline of performing in front of a crowd so much larger than any he had ever experienced. The lights dimmed as the main act prepared for their set, but Johnny couldn't hear anything but the pounding of his heart and the soft buzz in his ears. He felt a momentary rush of pride. It wasn't the kind of applause that would bring him a record deal or a spot on a famous tour. But it was genuine. He could feel it in his chest. He hadn't just been the blind kid with a guitar, he had been a Johnny, a musician. For a few minutes, he had transported himself and the audience to another place with his music. Yet, despite the warmth that surged in him, doubt still lingered, like a shadow in the back of his mind. Was that enough? Was that performance enough to get him noticed, to get him into the kind of spaces he dreamt of? Or was it just a fluke, a lucky shot that might never come again? As he stood backstage, still catching his breath, Jackson approached him. His face was lit up with pride, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a bigger picture, a challenge that was yet to come. "You did great, Ajani." "The crowd loved it," Jackson said, clapping him on the back. "But don't get too comfortable. That was just the beginning." Ajani turned to face Jackson, the excitement from the performance quickly beginning to fade into nerves once again. "What do you mean? That wasn't the end of it, was it?" Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh no, not at all. This is just the start. I've already got a few people interested. But if you want to get serious, if you really want to make a name for yourself, you're going to have to do a lot more than that." Ajani's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You're good, kid. You've got talent. But there's a whole world out there, and you've got to prove you belong in it. A few songs at a local venue won't do that. You need a plan. You need to work harder than you've ever worked before." Ajani felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had worked so hard already. The constant practice, the relentless focus on improving his skills. But he had to admit, Jackson was right. The music industry wasn't just about talent, it was about persistence, connections, and proving you could handle the grind. And the truth was, Ajani wasn't sure if he was ready for all of that. The next few weeks were a blur. Ajani had spent every waking hour practicing, trying to perfect his technique and come up with new material that would keep him in the spotlight. Jackson had lined up more gigs, but each one felt like a test, an audition to prove he could keep up with the demands of the industry. Each show seemed to get bigger, and the pressure on Ajani mounted with every passing day. But despite the shows, despite the crowds and the applause, something still gnawed at him. He wasn't just worried about his music anymore. He was beginning to worry about something else. Whether the world was truly ready for him. He wasn't just a musician, he was a blind, black boy trying to break into a world that hadn't always been welcoming to people like him. The more gigs he played, the more he began to notice the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, discomfort in the eyes of some people in the audience. There were the occasional whispers behind him, the occasional sidelong glance. He had always known that being black and blind in the music industry would be challenging, but now that he was seeing it firsthand, the weight of it felt more real than ever. It wasn't just that people didn't understand his disability or his race, it was that he didn't know how to change their minds. How could he make them see him for what he truly was, a musician who was here because of his talent, not because of some story they could pity? But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, those thoughts kept coming back. One night, after a particularly grueling gig where the crowd seemed only half engaged, Ajani sat alone in his room, his guitar resting on his lap. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant chatter of the city outside. Ajani ran his fingers over the strings, but no melody came. He felt empty, as if the music had drained out of him. His mother came into the room, noticing the tension in his posture. "You okay, baby?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. Ajani didn't answer right away. He stared down at his guitar, wishing he could find the right words. He hadn't wanted to burden her with his worries, but he couldn't keep it all in anymore. "I don't know, Mom," he said, his voice strained. "I just feel like I'm not getting anywhere. I'm playing these gigs, I'm doing everything they tell me to do, but I still feel like no one sees me for who I really am. They see me as a blind kid with a guitar. They don't hear me. They don't understand what I'm trying to do." His mother sat down beside him, placing her hand over his. "Ajani," she said softly, "there's always going to be people who don't see you the way you want to be seen. But you can't let that stop you. What matters is how you see yourself. And I see you, baby. I see the music in you. You have to keep playing for you, not for them. You've already proven you can make it. Now you just need to believe it." Ajani closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He had been so focused on what others thought that he had forgotten why he started in the first place. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition, it was about the music. I don't know if I can keep doing this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to keep doing it for anyone but yourself, his mother replied. You've got this gift, Ajani. Don't ever forget that. And no matter how hard it gets, you keep playing. The following days were a turning point for Ajani. He started to shift his focus. Instead of obsessing over the judgment of others, he concentrated on what mattered most, the music. He stopped looking for validation from the crowd and started playing for the sake of playing, for the joy of creating sound. And slowly, he began to feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about creating something that was uniquely his. As he played, his confidence grew. The fear didn't completely vanish, but it became something he could manage. Every time he took the stage, he reminded himself of his purpose. He was there to create, not to be accepted. And in that realization, Ajani started to understand something fundamental. The real test wasn't about conquering the world. It was about conquering himself. The days following Ajani's quiet reflection brought a new sense of purpose. He had learned something important: his music was not a means to earn others' approval. It wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about being true to his craft, his identity, and his passion. Music had always been an extension of his soul, something that allowed him to express parts of himself he could never articulate with words. He had to let go of the pressure and the need to be seen the way others expected him to be. His next gig was at the Blue Note, a legendary blues club downtown. This wasn't just any ordinary performance. The venue was known for hosting incredible talent, and it had a long history of musicians who had shaped the city's soundscape. It was the kind of place where artists came to prove themselves, to show that they could bring something fresh to the table. Ajani didn't care about the weight of the venue's history anymore. What mattered was that he had earned his spot. Jackson had arranged the performance, and though he had once seemed so confident, today, there was a shift in his demeanor. He'd been quieter lately, as if watching Ajani grow into something more than just a kid with a guitar. Jackson had always believed in Ajani's potential, but this time, there was a sense of cautious optimism. It wasn't just about a gig anymore, it was about the next step. The one that could change everything. Ajani sat on the edge of his bed, tuning his guitar, the low hum of the strings grounding him. He was no longer afraid of the big stages or the crowds. What scared him now was the thought of losing himself in the process of trying to prove something. He didn't need to prove anything. He just had to play. Ready, man? Jackson's voice broke through the quiet of the room, and Ajani looked up. Jackson was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, an inscrutable expression on his face. Ajani nodded. Yeah. Let's do it. The Blue Note was packed when they arrived. It wasn't the size of the crowd that intimidated Ajani, it was the weight of the eyes on him. This wasn't the kind of place where you could hide behind a band or a fancy light show. The audience here came for authenticity, for real music. If Ajani wasn't authentic, they would know. Here's your set list, Jackson said, handing him a piece of paper. Don't worry, I got you covered. Just focus on your music. You've got this. Ajani stared at the set list in his hands, his fingers running over the paper. The names of the songs seemed almost foreign to him now. You really think I'm ready for this? Jackson gave a tight smile. You've been ready since the first time you picked up that guitar. Just play your heart out. Backstage, Ajani had only a few minutes to gather his thoughts before the performance. The sound of clinking glasses and chatter from the audience seeped through the thick walls of the backstage area. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft hum of the world around him, trying to center himself. There were no distractions in his mind anymore, just his guitar, his music, and the sound of his heartbeat. As he made his way onto the stage, the nerves that used to threaten to paralyze him seemed to dissolve. This was his space now. This was where he belonged. He was no longer the blind boy with a guitar, He was a Johnny Black, a musician who had earned his right to be there. The lights dimmed as the crowd murmured in anticipation. For a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. Johnny adjusted his grip on his guitar, his fingers resting lightly on the strings. Then, without missing a beat, he started to play. The music flowed naturally, effortlessly. He could feel the pulse of the room, the rhythm of the people. It was as though the audience's energy was intertwined with his own. The nerves he had once felt evaporated with each note that resonated from his guitar. The sound seemed to float through the air, echoing in the room like a prayer. With every chord he strummed, he could feel himself growing more confident. The crowd was with him. He didn't need to see their faces to know they were listening, they were feeling the same things he was. His fingers moved faster, more fluid, as he lost himself in the music. The melody he created seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, a place he hadn't known existed until that moment. For the first time, he felt what it was like to truly connect with an audience, not because of his race or his disability, but because of the sound he was creating. His music was his voice, louder and clearer than anything he could say with words. But just as the music reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A heckler in the audience shouted, "Hey, blind boy. Are you sure you know where the strings are?" The comment cut through the music like a knife. Johnny's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, it felt as though the world around him paused. The audience's laughter rippled through the room, and the sting of the insult struck deep. The worst part was that it wasn't the first time he had heard such a comment. He had been mocked before, both in the world of music and outside of it. But something was different this time. He had come so far, and he wasn't going to let this small comment knock him off track. Instead of reacting in anger or retreating into himself, Johnny took a deep breath, letting the insult wash over him. He tightened his grip on the guitar, closed his eyes, and began to play even harder. The crowd's laughter faded as the music intensified, filling the room with an energy that had nothing to do with words. It was just sound, pure and raw. Johnny's fingers danced over the strings, the guitar singing with a passion that only he could understand. Each note was a defiant statement, a declaration that he wouldn't be defined by the limitations others tried to place on him. He would show them what it meant to be a musician, a true artist, no matter who or what tried to tear him down. As the last note of the song rang out, Johnny opened his eyes, his chest heaving with the effort. The crowd was silent for a beat, and then the applause began. It was slower at first, hesitant, but then it grew louder, more genuine. They hadn't just heard him play, they had felt the emotion in every note. Johnny stood still, his heart racing, as the applause washed over him. It wasn't just because he was blind or because he had overcome some obstacle. It was because they had heard his music. They had felt his soul in the strings, and in that moment, Johnny knew, he didn't need anyone's approval. He had his own. Backstage, after the performance, Jackson was waiting for him. His face was lit up with a grin, and his eyes gleamed with pride. "Damn, Johnny. That was something else. You owned that stage," he said, pulling Johnny into a brief hug. Johnny smiled, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. "Thanks, Jackson. It felt different tonight." Jackson nodded. "I can see it. You've changed, man. And it's not just about your playing. It's the way you carry yourself now. You've found your voice." Johnny didn't say anything for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I think I've finally learned what it means to own the music. To play it for me, and not for anyone else." "Exactly," Jackson said, clapping him on the back. "And that's when the real magic happens." Johnny looked out at the audience, who were slowly filing out of the venue, their faces lit by the glow of streetlights. He realized then that he had done it. He had overcome the doubts, the insecurities, and the mockery. He had proven to himself that he could make it, not because of how the world saw him, but because of how he saw himself. For the first time in a long while, Johnny felt truly free. Johnny's fingers continued to hum with the echo of the performance. The days after the gig at the Blue Note were a blur of practice, new music, and the occasional text from Jackson. But Johnny knew that he was on the verge of something important. The last few weeks had changed him. The music had changed him. And now, there was no turning back. Despite the successes of his recent performances, there was still an unspoken challenge that hung in the air, waiting to be addressed. The feeling that, no matter how much Johnny accomplished, there would always be someone who doubted him. Someone who saw his blindness or his race as a barrier that could never be overcome. But every time he played, that thought seemed less real, less significant. Johnny's mind was focused on the music, and that was where he needed to stay. Jackson had been working behind the scenes to line up more gigs for Johnny. But there was something new on the horizon, something big. It was the biggest venue he had ever played, the House of Blues. The name alone was enough to make Johnny's heart race. This was a milestone for any artist, let alone a young, blind black boy from a small town. He had heard legends about the House of Blues, musicians who had started there and gone on to build careers that spanned decades. It was a rite of passage, a proving ground. And now, it was Johnny's turn. The anxiety that had once consumed him before performances was starting to feel like a distant memory. But with the House of Blues, that old feeling crept back. This was the big league. He wasn't just performing for a crowd of people now. He was performing for the industry, for the ones who could make or break a career. What if I'm not good enough, he asked, more to himself than to anyone else, as he sat on the edge of his bed, his guitar resting on his knee. He didn't voice his concerns to Jackson, he didn't want to sound weak. But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. You are good enough, Johnny. But you've got to do something big. Something that people won't forget. You've got to show them why you're here. Jackson's voice had a new edge to it. The kind that came with the knowledge that the House of Blues wasn't just another gig. It was the moment. Johnny could feel it in the way Jackson looked at him now, almost like he was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't just about a performance anymore, it was about creating a legacy. Johnny had always known the importance of his music, but now he understood its weight. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever underestimated him, every person who had ever mocked him for being different. He wasn't just playing for the crowd, he was playing for himself, and for everyone who had ever struggled to fit in. The night of the performance, Johnny stood behind the curtain of the House of Blues, his guitar slung over his shoulder. The noise of the audience could be heard through the thick curtain, a constant low hum of excitement and anticipation. It was hard for him to tell exactly how many people were in the room, but he could sense the size and energy of the crowd from the vibrations that radiated through the floor. He had performed in front of hundreds before, but something about this venue felt different. 5 minutes, a voice called to him from the wings. Johnny nodded, trying to calm his breath. His hands were steady, but his pulse raced in his chest. The anticipation built inside him like a storm, the excitement mingling with fear. Could he do it? Could he rise to the occasion? Jackson came over to him, clapping him on the back. You're going to blow them away, he said with a grin. Johnny forced a smile, but the weight of the moment was still heavy. He was about to step onto one of the biggest stages of his life. The stakes had never felt so high. Thanks, Jackson, Johnny replied, his voice steady despite the nerves that churned inside. I won't let you down. The lights above the stage flashed on, and the crowd erupted into cheers. This was it. There was no turning back. As Johnny walked onto the stage, the lights blinding him at first, the noise of the crowd fell away, and he was left in a pocket of stillness. This was where he was meant to be. His fingers wrapped around the neck of his guitar, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just him and the music. He started with a soft, slow chord, the sound of the guitar cutting through the stillness like a prayer. He let the melody build, allowing it to stretch out, breathing life into the music. The crowd quieted, sensing the shift. Johnny could feel the tension in the room, the anticipation hanging in the air. They were waiting for him to prove something. They were waiting for him to show them that he deserved to be there. Johnny's hands moved faster, more confidently now, as the rhythm of the song picked up. He poured everything into the music, the pain, the triumph, the struggle of being seen as less than what he was. The notes carried his emotions like a vessel, each strum a declaration of his worth. His blindness didn't limit him. His race didn't define him. He was here because he had the talent. He was here because he had the passion. The audience was silent now, hanging on every note. There was no mocking, no judgment, just music. And as the song reached its climax, Johnny's fingers danced across the strings, faster and faster, until the final note rang out and the room erupted into applause. For a moment, everything stood still. The applause was deafening, but Johnny couldn't hear it over the pounding of his own heart. He had done it. He had crossed the threshold. He had taken his place on this stage, and he hadn't just played for them, he had owned it. Backstage, after the performance, Jackson was waiting for him with a huge smile on his face. That was it. That was the one. You've just proved to everyone here that you belong. Johnny felt a mix of relief and triumph. I didn't expect that kind of reaction, he said, his voice barely audible from the rush of emotions. You did it, Johnny. You made them listen. You made them feel what you feel. Johnny smiled, his fingers still tingling from the performance. For the first time, he understood what Jackson meant. He hadn't just performed. He had shared a part of himself with the audience, and they had accepted it, embraced it. It wasn't about his disability. It wasn't about his race. It was about the music. Johnny had finally broken through the barrier. As he left the House of Blues that night, the night air felt cooler, the city's lights more vibrant. He wasn't just walking through the streets anymore, he was walking through a new chapter in his life. A chapter where anything was possible. He had made it past the doubts, past the fears, and now the world was his to conquer. And as he walked, he couldn't help but think of all the moments that had led him here. The struggles, the mockery, the late nights spent practicing, the people who had doubted him. It had all been worth it. Because now, Johnny wasn't just a kid with a guitar. He was a force to be reckoned with. The journey had only just begun. Johnny had barely slept the night after his performance at the House of Blues. The adrenaline still surged through his veins, and his mind buzzed with a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and excitement. His phone had been flooded with messages of congratulations, from fellow musicians to fans, even strangers who had witnessed the magic of his set. His name was beginning to spread, quietly at first, but Johnny knew that with every performance, the ripple was growing, expanding. He had come further than he ever thought possible, but as much as he relished the recognition, there was an undeniable feeling that there was still so much more to be done. The next morning, as the sun poured through the blinds of his small apartment, Johnny sat by the window, his guitar across his lap. He had a few days off before his next big gig, but instead of resting, he felt an overwhelming urge to practice. He wasn't satisfied with the way things were going, not yet. There was something missing, something more he could give. Jackson had told him more than once that he needed to step up his game, keep pushing boundaries. You've got raw talent, Johnny, but to make it, you need to keep evolving. You can't settle. Johnny understood what Jackson meant. It was easy to get comfortable after a big win, to start believing that things would just fall into place. But Johnny wasn't the type to rest on his laurels. He had seen too many people get left behind by doing that. And the way his hands ached for the guitar, the way his mind constantly hummed with melodies, told him that there was something greater just within reach. He strummed a few chords, feeling the vibration under his fingertips. His songs were starting to take shape, but he wanted more depth, more emotion. The technicality of his playing was sharp, yes, but it was the soul of the music that still needed to be fully realized. There was a song he had been working on for months, a piece that was personal, something he had yet to reveal to anyone. The rhythm was slow, almost haunting, like a prayer whispered in the dead of night. It was about the struggles he had faced, the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind, but also the triumphs, the moments where he had overcome it all. It wasn't just about music, it was about life. His life. But no matter how many times he played it, something still felt off. It lacked the depth, the power that it needed. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew the piece was important. He had to make it perfect. Later that week, Jackson came by to check in. Johnny had been rehearsing non-stop, and Jackson could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're working too hard, man. You need to take a break," Jackson said, his voice concerned. "I'm fine," Johnny replied quickly, strumming another chord absent-mindedly. I need this to be right. I need it to feel real. I can't afford to mess this up." Jackson leaned back in the chair, eyeing Johnny for a moment before speaking again. "What are you afraid of, Johnny? That the music won't be good enough?" Johnny stopped playing, a little startled by Jackson's insight. "I don't know. I guess I'm afraid of not being enough. Afraid that I'll never really make it, no matter how much I try." Jackson's expression softened. "You've already made it, Johnny. You've proven yourself. Now, it's not about being enough for anyone else. It's about being enough for you." Johnny didn't say anything for a moment. He wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't that simple. But deep down, he knew Jackson was right. It wasn't about pleasing others, it was about sharing the music he had created, the pieces of himself that only the guitar could reveal. The following days were filled with moments of reflection and breakthroughs. Johnny took a step back from his usual practice routine, giving himself time to think, to really listen. He realized that the music had always been there, it wasn't about forcing it out, but about letting it flow. And when he stopped trying so hard to perfect every note, that's when the music began to take its true shape. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch of his apartment with his guitar, he played that song again. This time, something felt different. The melody was still haunting, but it was deeper, richer, and more powerful. His fingers moved with purpose, each strum echoing the words that had long been buried in his heart. As he played, he realized that this was the song he had been looking for, the song that would carry his story to the world. It wasn't just the notes he played, it was the emotion in each chord, the strength in the silence between the sounds. Johnny had finally tapped into the essence of what made his music special, the way his heart bled through the strings. That evening, Jackson called. "You've been quiet, man. Everything all right?" Johnny smiled softly, feeling the weight of the past few days lift off his shoulders. "Yeah, Jackson. I think I finally got it." "Got what?" Jackson asked, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "The song. The one I've been working on for months. I finally got it right." Jackson chuckled. "I knew you would. When you're ready, you're ready." Johnny's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I want to record it. I want to share it with the world." Jackson was silent for a moment. "Are you sure? You know what this means. Once it's out there, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Johnny said, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm ready." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jackson arranged for a small recording session at a local studio, and soon Johnny was standing in front of a microphone, his guitar resting in his hands, his heart pounding in anticipation. He looked at the engineer through the glass. "I'm ready," he said. The engineer nodded, hitting a button on the console. "Let's make history." Johnny took a deep breath and began to play. The song poured from him like a river, every note carrying the weight of his journey. It was raw, it was vulnerable, and it was beautiful. As the final chord resonated in the room, the engineer nodded in approval. "That's it, man. That's the one. Ajani sat back, feeling a rush of emotion wash over him. He had done it. He had shared the most intimate part of himself with the world. And now, there was no turning back. As the recording session ended, Jackson came over, clapping him on the back. "You did it, man. That was incredible. I think you've just created something that will change everything." Ajani smiled, his heart soaring. "I hope so. I really do." But deep down, he knew it wasn't about changing the world. It was about sharing his story, his music, his truth. Because when it came down to it, that's all he had ever wanted to do. And now, he was finally doing it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ajani stood at the window of his small apartment, staring out at the city below. His hands were still trembling from the recording session. The rawness of the song, the vulnerability he had poured into it, it felt like he had just taken a step into uncharted waters. He knew this song would be a turning point, but he hadn't expected the wave of emotions it would bring. It was one thing to create music in private, to play for the few who had the privilege to hear it, but it was another thing entirely to release it into the world. Ajani had never shared his deepest fears and joys so openly. Yet, as he reflected on the vulnerability he had shown in that song, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The burden of keeping that part of himself hidden, of keeping the real Ajani locked away from the world, was finally gone. The following week, after a few final edits, Jackson uploaded the song to streaming platforms. It was called "Voice of the Unseen." It wasn't just a song, it was a declaration. The title reflected more than just the personal struggle Ajani had faced, it was a tribute to everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unheard. Jackson called him right after the track went live. "It's out there, man. The world is about to hear you." Ajani didn't know what to say. "I can't believe it's real. It feels surreal." Jackson chuckled. "That's what happens when you finally take the leap. Now, we wait. But trust me, this is only the beginning." The next few days felt like a blur of anticipation. Ajani tried to keep himself busy with practice, but every time he picked up his guitar, his mind wandered back to the song. He found himself checking his phone more often than usual, watching the number of streams grow, the comments flood in. It was strange, seeing his music being heard by people he didn't know. Strangers, fans, and even other musicians were starting to take notice. Then, one morning, as he scrolled through his notifications, something stopped him dead in his tracks. A tweet had been shared by a major music influencer, someone with millions of followers. The tweet read, "If you haven't heard Ajani's new song Voice of the Unseen, stop what you're doing and listen. This young man is about to change the game. #new artist #blind but not broken #Ajani rising." Ajani felt a rush of disbelief. This was the kind of recognition that could change everything. The kind of recognition he had only dreamed of. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Jackson. "You're trending, bro. I told you this was only the beginning. This is your moment." Ajani's heart raced. It was happening. The song was being shared, listened to, discussed. His vulnerability had been embraced. It felt like a floodgate had opened, and he had no idea where it would take him, but he was ready to ride the wave. As the days passed, the momentum built. Media outlets began reaching out for interviews, asking about the story behind the song, about his journey as a blind, black musician trying to make his way in the world. He was invited to podcast shows, featured on music blogs, and even asked to perform live on a popular morning show. For Ajani, it was a whirlwind he had never expected, and yet, somehow, it felt like everything was falling into place. But as the pressure grew, so did the anxiety. The attention was intoxicating, but it was also overwhelming. Ajani had always kept his circle small, his family, Jackson, a few close friends. Now, suddenly, he was thrust into the public eye. People were paying attention to him, and while that was the dream of many artists, for a Johnny, it felt like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, scrolling through yet another message from a fan telling him how much his music had impacted them, he felt a pang of doubt. He had always wanted to be heard, but now that people were listening, he wasn't sure how to handle it. The pressure to keep creating, to meet the expectations of fans and critics, was starting to weigh heavily on him. It was in that moment that Jackson called again. "How are you holding up, man?" A Johnny sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a lot. I don't know if I'm ready for all this attention. I mean, it's great and all, but it feels like there's this weight now. Like people are expecting me to keep giving them something. What if I can't?" Jackson paused before responding, his voice calm. "Johnny, you've been doing this long before the world started paying attention. The only thing that's changed is that now more people get to hear your voice. But it's still your voice. Don't lose yourself in the noise." Johnny leaned back against the couch, letting Jackson's words settle in. "I'm trying. But I'm scared, Jackson. What if it's all just a fluke? What if I can't do it again?" "You will," Jackson said, his voice unwavering. "Because you don't create music for the world. You create it for yourself. You put your heart into it. That's what matters. And that's why people are responding. You're not trying to be something you're not. You're being a Johnny, and that's more than enough." Johnny nodded, feeling the weight in his chest lighten a little. Jackson was right. It wasn't about meeting some external expectation, it was about staying true to himself, to the music he had always created. His journey wasn't just about proving others wrong or chasing validation. It was about sharing his story, his truth, in the most authentic way he could. A few weeks later, Johnny was scheduled for another big performance. This time, it was in front of a crowd of industry professionals, producers, agents, musicians. People who had the power to change the trajectory of his career forever. As he prepared for the show, he felt the same nerves creep up again, the same anxiety that had followed him through every major performance. But this time, he welcomed it. He knew it was part of the process. It was a sign that he cared, that this mattered to him. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his belief in himself. The night of the performance arrived, and Johnny stepped onto the stage with the familiar warmth of the spotlight bathing him. This was it. No more self-doubt. No more fears. Just Johnny, his guitar, and the music. As the first chord rang out, his confidence bloomed. The crowd was quiet at first, listening intently. Then, as he played, something shifted in the air. It was as though his music had the power to draw people in, to transport them. Every note, every strum carried the essence of everything he had been through, and the room was filled with the weight of it. By the time the final note echoed through the venue, the crowd was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Jackson was backstage, watching with a proud grin. Johnny had done it again. He had created something that connected with people, something that transcended everything. And for the first time in a long while, Johnny believed it, too. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity for Johnny. His life had changed almost overnight, from performing small gigs at local venues to being asked to play at major events and festivals. Every week seemed to bring new opportunities, interviews, social media shout-outs, invitations to high-profile gigs, but with each opportunity came an increasing weight of expectation. The pressure was becoming harder to ignore. There was always another song to write, another show to perform, another interview to give. Johnny couldn't escape the constant reminder that the world was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He had done something extraordinary with Voice of the Unseen, but what if he couldn't do it again? What if this success was a fluke? The thought gnawed at him, keeping him up at night and pulling him away from the music he loved. One night, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Johnny sat alone in his apartment, his guitar propped up beside him. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion weigh him down. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, a notification flashing on the screen. It was another message from Jackson. "Are you okay? You've been quiet lately." Johnny hesitated for a moment before responding. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but Jackson had been right. He hadn't been himself lately, and it was starting to show. "I don't know, man. I'm struggling with this. There's so much pressure. I don't know if I can keep up with all the expectations." Jackson's reply came quickly. "You don't have to do it alone, Johnny. You never have. You've got a team, people who believe in you. But more than that, you've got your own voice. Trust it. Don't try to meet anyone's expectations but your own." Johnny stared at the screen, Jackson's words sinking in. It wasn't the first time Jackson had said something like this, but this time, the weight of it felt different. Johnny had been so focused on the expectations of the industry, the fans, the critics, that he had forgotten the most important thing, his music. His truth. His heart. He put the phone down and took a deep breath. He needed to remind himself why he started all this in the first place, because music was his escape, his salvation. It wasn't about living up to the world's standards. It was about sharing the songs that lived in his soul. The next day, Johnny decided to take a break from the relentless cycle of performances and rehearsals. He needed time to reconnect with the music, to find the part of himself he had lost in the midst of the hype. He grabbed his guitar and went for a walk in the park, the instrument resting comfortably in his hands. The air was crisp, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Johnny found a quiet spot near a small pond and sat down on the grass. He let the sounds of nature fill the silence, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. And then, as he always did, he began to play. His fingers brushed the strings, and the melody flowed freely from his heart. It wasn't a song for anyone but him. It was raw, unrefined, just like the music that had first inspired him to pick up a guitar. As the song unfolded, Johnny felt the tension in his shoulders ease. He didn't have to write the next big hit. He didn't have to be anyone other than the artist he had always been. The music was his, and that was enough. The song he played that day was different from anything he had written before. It wasn't polished or perfect. But it was honest. And for Johnny, that was the most important thing. The next evening, Johnny found himself at another industry event. It was a glamorous gala, filled with important people, producers, executives, other musicians, all dressed in their finest. He stood off to the side, feeling a little out of place. He wasn't used to these kinds of events. The conversations were superficial, and the fake smiles grated on him. He wanted to be anywhere but here. But then, as he scanned the room, his eyes landed on someone familiar, Maya, the woman who had taken an interest in his music from the very beginning. She was standing near the bar, chatting with a producer, but when she saw Johnny, her eyes lit up. Johnny, she called, walking toward him with a warm smile. He gave her a small wave. "Hey, Maya. Good to see you. Are you enjoying the night?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. Johnny shrugged. "It's not really my scene. You know me, crowds and all that." Maya laughed, a genuine sound. "Yeah, I remember. But hey, you're a star now, Johnny. You're going to have to get used to this stuff." "I don't know if I ever will," Johnny said, shaking his head. "It feels fake. Like I'm just a prop in someone else's game." Maya's smile faded a little as she regarded him carefully. "I get it. It's a lot of pressure. But you're not a prop. You're here because of your music. Don't lose sight of that. The people here want to be around you because they believe in what you're doing." Johnny's heart skipped a beat. He'd never thought of it that way. He had been so caught up in the artificial side of the industry that he'd forgotten why he was here in the first place. He looked at Maya, meeting her eyes. "You're right. I've been so focused on the business side of all this that I've lost track of what matters most. The music." Maya smiled again, a soft, understanding expression. "That's why you'll make it, Ajani. Because you're true to yourself. Just remember that the world can't define you. You define yourself." Ajani took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had been trying so hard to meet other people's expectations that he had forgotten about his own. A few days later, after another successful performance, Ajani sat down to write. He no longer felt the pressure to deliver a hit. This time, he was simply writing for himself. The song that came out of him was pure and unfiltered, a reflection of everything he had been through, everything he had learned, and everything he still had yet to discover. It was a song about embracing imperfections, about understanding that success wasn't about being flawless. It was about finding peace within yourself, no matter what the world expected from you. As he finished the final notes of the song, Ajani looked up from his guitar and smiled. This was the music he had been searching for all along. The kind of music that came from the heart. The kind that could only be made when you stopped trying to impress others and started being true to yourself. He picked up his phone and texted Jackson. "Got it," he typed. "I finally got it." The following weeks felt like an emotional whirlwind for Ajani. After the realization that he had been chasing external validation rather than staying true to his roots, he found himself at a crossroads. For the first time, he wasn't worried about how people would perceive his music. He wasn't concerned with meeting the expectations of the industry, the fans, or even his friends. Ajani was focused on one thing, finding his true sound, the sound that came from deep within his soul. It was time to stop playing the game and start creating music that felt authentic to him. The pressure of constantly being under the spotlight hadn't faded, but his approach to it had changed. Ajani realized that his music wasn't just for the world, it was his voice, his form of expression. And that's when it hit him, for the first time in his career, Ajani felt truly free. The studio sessions with Jackson had become a ritual, but this time, something felt different. As Ajani walked through the door of the recording studio, he noticed a calmness he hadn't felt in weeks. He wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't hoping for approval. It was just him and his guitar, and that was enough. "Ready to lay down some tracks?" Jackson asked with his usual enthusiasm, but there was a softer edge to his voice now, as though he too had noticed a shift in Ajani's energy. Ajani nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I think so. I've got something new." "What's it called?" Ajani hesitated, but only for a moment. "I haven't figured that part out yet. I'm just going to play." Jackson gave a knowing nod, the kind of nod only a true collaborator would give, a nod that said, "I trust you." He gestured to the mic setup. "All right, man. Let's hear it." Ajani sat down, picking up his guitar. He strummed the strings gently, letting the sound fill the quiet space of the studio. The notes were slow at first, introspective. Then, as if the music was coming alive on its own, the melody picked up, faster, more urgent, until it felt like a wave crashing against the shore. This was the sound Ajani had been searching for, raw, untamed, full of longing and pain, but also hope. The rhythm shifted, becoming more upbeat as his fingers danced across the strings. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of someone finally embracing who they were, flaws and all. This song wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about crafting a hit. It was about capturing a feeling, a moment in time. Jackson watched him intently from the control booth, his fingers hovering over the mixing desk, waiting for the right moment to add his touch. But this time, he didn't need to direct Ajani. The music spoke for itself. After a few minutes, Ajani stopped playing, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, save for the sound of his breathing. "Damn," Jackson finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's something else, Ajani." Ajani exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from his chest. "It feels right. It's more than right." "That's the real you," Jackson said, standing up and walking into the studio. "You just unlocked something that's been inside you all along. This isn't about chasing the charts or fitting into some box. This is you. It's raw. It's honest. It's powerful." Ajani smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in months. This was the music he had been meant to make. "I think it's time for the world to hear this side of me." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly to polish the track, but they made sure to keep the raw, unfiltered energy intact. Ajani's goal was clear: he wanted to share this piece of himself with the world, not just the industry. It wasn't about catering to trends, it was about connecting with the people who had been there for him, who had supported him from the beginning. When the track was finally ready, Jackson wasted no time in uploading it to the streaming platforms. The release was a quiet one, no big announcements, no press conferences. Ajani wanted it to speak for itself. He wasn't looking for the grand spectacle. He was looking for something real. But something unexpected happened. As the track went live, the response was overwhelming. Fans who had been following Ajani from the very beginning flooded social media with messages of gratitude. They praised the vulnerability in his music, the authenticity of his sound. One fan tweeted, "Ajani's new track is exactly what I needed today. It's raw. It's real. It's the sound of freedom." Others shared their own stories of how Ajani's music had helped them through difficult times. People who had been through struggles, people who had been told they didn't belong, found solace in his lyrics. For the first time, Ajani didn't feel like he was performing for a crowd. He felt like he was having a conversation with his listeners. The connection was deeper now. It wasn't about the numbers or the industry praise. It was about the people who had found something in his music that resonated with their own lives. The buzz around the new track caught the attention of some major names in the industry. Ajani received messages from influential figures, producers who had once seemed unreachable. But he didn't chase them. He wasn't interested in the fame anymore. He was focused on something more important: his music, and the way it could connect with people. The next big event on his schedule was a music festival, one of the largest in the country. Thousands of people would be in attendance, and Ajani had been given a prime slot to perform. The pressure was on. But this time, there was no fear. There was no anxiety. For the first time in his career, Ajani was excited, not because of the crowd or the opportunity, but because he had something real to share. The day of the festival arrived, and Ajani stood backstage, his heart beating in anticipation. The noise of the crowd, the buzz of energy in the air, it all felt so familiar now. But as he waited for his turn, he remembered Jackson's words: "You're not here to perform for anyone. You're here to share your truth." When it was finally his time, Ajani walked on stage, his guitar slung across his back. The crowd's cheers were deafening, but he didn't hear them. He only heard the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then, as the first note rang out, everything else faded away. It was just him, his guitar, and the music. And for the first time, Ajani felt truly free. The performance was electric. The crowd responded to the honesty in his voice, to the authenticity in his playing. His set was filled with the raw emotion he had channeled into his music, and the energy from the audience reflected back at him. It wasn't just a performance, it was a shared experience. Ajani knew he was connecting with these people on a deeper level, beyond the surface. This was what it was all about: the music, the message, the truth. After the show, as the crowd began to disperse, Ajani felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He had been afraid of what the world would think, afraid that his truth wouldn't be enough. But now, he knew that it was. And that was all that mattered. The performance at the festival had been a turning point for Ajani. It wasn't just a show, it was a declaration of who he was. Someone who had finally let go of the fear of not measuring up, someone who no longer sought approval from anyone but himself. The crowd's response had been electric, and for the first time, Ajani felt truly seen for who he was, not just for his talent or his rise to fame, but for the person he had become. But as much as Ajani relished the moment, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that lingered in the back of his mind: what now? The questions were always there, lingering like an unanswered riddle. His music was evolving, his connection with his fans was stronger than ever, but the road ahead still seemed uncertain. For every step forward, there was the lingering fear of what might happen if he couldn't keep up, if the next song wasn't as well received, if the industry grew tired of him. In the days that followed the festival, Ajani retreated into his own space, his apartment, his guitar, his thoughts. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, texts, emails, and notifications, but Ajani found it harder to engage with all the noise. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the support, but there was a growing sense of isolation. The world had been watching his every move for months, and now he felt like he was losing himself in the spotlight. Jackson had noticed the change. It wasn't as obvious as it had been before, but Ajani's enthusiasm was waning. His usual spark, the one that had lit up his performances, seemed to flicker instead of burn brightly. One evening, as Ajani sat alone in his apartment, he stared out the window at the city skyline. The streets below were alive with movement, the lights flashing like a million dreams, yet Ajani felt detached from it all. He reached for his guitar, strumming the strings absent-mindedly, the familiar sound grounding him, but even the music felt distant. It wasn't the joy he had once felt. It was more like a lifeline, a tether to something that used to matter. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. "Hey, man, can we talk?" Jackson's voice came through the door, soft yet firm. Ajani set his guitar down and stood up. He wasn't in the mood for another conversation about music, but he knew Jackson wouldn't take no for an answer. Opening the door, he saw Jackson standing there, concern written on his face. "Sure. Come on in," Ajani muttered, stepping aside. Jackson walked in, closing the door behind him. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken words, but after a long pause, Jackson spoke. "You've been distant," he said. "And I get it, man. The pressure's real. But I can see it. You're not the same. What's going on?" Ajani took a deep breath. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to acknowledge that the same thing that had once ignited him was now suffocating him. But Jackson was his friend. The only person who had been with him from the very beginning. "I don't know if I can keep up with all of this anymore, Jackson," Ajani confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can keep doing it. I'm scared that I won't have anything left to give. People expect me to always be on, always creating, always being something they can look up to, but what if I'm just tired? What if I've given everything I've got?" Jackson didn't respond immediately. He sat down across from Ajani, his eyes not filled with judgment, but with understanding. "You've given a lot, man. And you've earned everything that's come your way. But don't forget, this journey isn't about being perfect. It's about being true to yourself. You've built something incredible, but that doesn't mean you have to keep pushing yourself to the breaking point. Take a step back. Find your balance." Ajani looked at his friend, feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt. Jackson was right. He had built something incredible, he had made it this far because of his authenticity, his music, and his voice. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of why he started. "What if I can't find it again?" Ajani asked, his voice small. "What if I can't find my way back to the music that made me fall in love with this in the first place?" Jackson stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "I know it's hard. The world wants more from you, but you've got to remember why you're doing this. You don't have to be a machine, Ajani. You don't have to give them what they expect. You've got to find your own rhythm again. Maybe that means taking a step back, rediscovering what brought you joy in the first place. Ajani was quiet for a moment, letting Jackson's words sink in. There was a heavy silence in the room, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like space, like an opportunity to breathe again. I don't know what that looks like yet, Ajani said finally, standing up. But I'm willing to try. Jackson smiled, clapping him on the back. Good. Take your time, man. You've got this. The days that followed were slower. Ajani stopped obsessing over every opportunity and every performance. He started playing for himself again, rediscovering the joy he had once felt in music. He spent hours in his apartment, writing songs for the sake of expression, not for the sake of anyone else's approval. He even revisited some of the older songs he had written before he became famous, the songs that had helped him find his voice in the first place. There were moments of doubt, of course. The thought that maybe he was walking away from the life he had worked so hard to build lingered in the back of his mind. But every time he picked up his guitar, every time the music flowed from his fingertips, Ajani felt something shift inside him. He didn't need the spotlight to be who he was. He didn't need the applause to know that he mattered. His music was enough. Weeks later, Ajani was backstage at a small, intimate venue. The room was filled with people who had followed his journey from the very beginning, his die-hard fans who had seen him play in tiny bars and clubs, long before the festival stages and the sold-out shows. This wasn't a huge production, no flashing lights or giant screens. It was just Ajani, his guitar, and a room full of people who appreciated him for who he was, not for the image, not for the fame, but for the music. As he stepped onto the stage, Ajani felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was where he was meant to be. This was what it was all about. He didn't need to chase anything anymore. He just needed to be himself. The first chord rang out, and the crowd fell silent, waiting for him to play. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began. The sound of the crowd faded into the background as Ajani strummed the first few notes of his guitar. The stage felt different this time, smaller, more intimate. It wasn't the massive festival stage, it wasn't the glitzy production, and it wasn't the screaming masses that had once made his heart race with anticipation. No, this was something more personal. Something more, grounded. As the song flowed, Ajani closed his eyes and let the music guide him. For the first time in a long time, there was no pressure, no expectation. There was only the sound of his guitar, the rhythm of his heartbeat, and the connection he felt with every person in the room. It felt like coming home. The venue was a small but cozy space, dimly lit, with an aura of warmth and nostalgia. The walls were lined with posters of musicians from different eras, from legendary rock bands to indie artists. This was the kind of place where people came to listen, to experience music in its purest form. Ajani had decided to take a step away from the high-profile gigs and return to his roots. Back to the music that had first captured his heart, the raw, unrefined sound that had resonated with so many before fame changed everything. The crowd in front of him was small, perhaps 200 people at most, but there was something so authentic about the way they listened. No one was here for spectacle. They were here for the music. They were here for Ajani. And for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't feel overwhelming, it felt like a gift. As Ajani finished the song, the room erupted in applause. The sound was warm and genuine, the kind of applause that came from a place of shared understanding, not obligation. Ajani smiled softly and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "This next song is one I've been working on for a while. It's a reflection of where I am right now, what I've been going through. It's called The Road to Rediscovery." The crowd went quiet, waiting in anticipation. Ajani could feel the weight of their attention, but it didn't feel suffocating this time. It felt like a soft embrace, as though they were with him on this journey. He began to play. The notes were slower at first, tentative. But then, like a burst of light breaking through dark clouds, the melody gained strength. Johnny poured his emotions into the song, each note ringing with the complexity of his feelings, the uncertainty, the fear, the hope. It was a song about loss and growth, about finding a way back to what truly mattered. The lyrics flowed naturally, as though they had been waiting to be sung for years. I've been lost, searching for a way. Chasing shadows, running from the day. But now I see the road ahead. A path I've walked, but thought was dead. The crowd was completely still, captivated by his performance. In that moment, Johnny realized something profound. He wasn't just sharing a song. He was sharing a piece of himself, a truth that had been buried for far too long. As the last note hung in the air, Johnny opened his eyes. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the guitar's final reverberations. And then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't loud or rushed, but it was real. It was the kind of applause that came from deep inside, from a place of true connection. Johnny felt it in his chest, a warmth that spread from his heart to his fingertips. This was the kind of response he had been searching for. Genuine, unfiltered, unforced. Backstage, Johnny collapsed onto the couch, his body exhausted from the performance. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that made him want to retreat. It was the kind of exhaustion that came after you had given all of yourself, after you had shared everything you had to give. Jackson was sitting next to him, watching him closely. You killed it out there, man. Johnny chuckled softly. Yeah. I felt pretty good about that one. Jackson smiled, but his eyes held a note of concern. I know you've been questioning a lot of things, Johnny. But you've got something real here. This is who you are. Don't lose sight of it. Johnny nodded, his mind drifting back to the performance, to the way the crowd had responded. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found his footing again. I'm trying, Jackson, he said quietly. I really am. Jackson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to try so hard, man. Just be yourself. You've already got everything you need. The next few days passed in a blur. Johnny had been so wrapped up in his music, in rediscovering who he was, that he didn't pay much attention to the world outside of his small circle. But as his manager, Sarah, reminded him, the world hadn't forgotten about him. Johnny, you've been making waves, Sarah said, sitting across from him at a coffee shop. People are talking about your performance at the venue. Your fans are responding to your new music. They're excited. You've got something special here. Johnny looked down at his coffee, swirling the liquid absent-mindedly. I don't know if I want to go back to all of that, Sarah. I don't want to go back to the pressure, the expectations, the constant hustle for more. I just want to make music that feels right. I get that, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. But you've got to understand, this is what people want from you now. They want the real you. And that's powerful, Johnny. You've got an opportunity to lead, to change the narrative. You can still make the music you want, but you can do it on your own terms. This is your chance to redefine everything. Johnny sighed. The idea of going back to the industry grind, the endless promotion, the scrutiny, it was a daunting thought. But Sarah was right. This was a chance to do something different. A chance to shape the next chapter of his career on his own terms. Over the next few weeks, Johnny began to see things differently. He started recording more music, experimenting with new sounds and styles. He wasn't trying to please anyone. He wasn't chasing after what was trending. He was doing it for himself, because he knew that the real magic came from within. Jackson was by his side, every step of the way. They worked together, pushing each other to take risks, to explore new ideas. The music that began to take shape was unlike anything Johnny had ever created before. It was bold, experimental, but also deeply personal. And when it was finally time to release the new album, Johnny felt ready to share this new chapter of his life with the world. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that, no matter what happened, he had found something that was worth more than fame or fortune. He had found himself. The days following the release of Ajani's new music were a whirlwind of emotion, anticipation, and uncertainty. His fans embraced the new sound with open arms, praising the raw honesty and vulnerability in his lyrics. The album was a breath of fresh air in an industry that often demanded conformity, and Ajani could feel the shift in the air. But even with the overwhelming support, the pressure wasn't gone. It wasn't something that could just be wished away. Every time Ajani scrolled through his phone, every time he checked his social media, there were constant reminders of the expectations that followed him. The need to maintain his success, to be ever present in the media, to constantly produce. Jackson had noticed the subtle shift in Ajani. The artist was thriving creatively, but the weight of his past success still clung to him like a shadow. There were moments when Ajani was lost in thought, staring out into the distance, and Jackson knew that deep down, Ajani was wrestling with something much bigger than his career. It was the question of identity, the fear of being trapped in an image that no longer felt authentic. One afternoon, as they sat in Ajani's apartment, Jackson could see the tiredness in his friend's eyes. "How's it going?" Jackson asked, leaning back against the couch. Ajani exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, man. It's like, everything's changed, but nothing's changed. I'm happy with the music. I'm proud of the album. But I still feel like I'm being pulled in a million different directions. I feel like I can't breathe sometimes. Every move I make is being scrutinized. I can't do anything without someone having an opinion about it." Jackson nodded, his expression serious. "I get it. You've been running at full speed for so long, trying to keep up with the world's expectations. But you've got to remember something, you don't have to answer to anyone but yourself. You've already done more than enough. You've proven that you can create, that you can succeed. Now, it's time to take control of what happens next." Ajani looked at his friend, the weight of Jackson's words sinking in. He'd spent so long trying to prove himself to others, so long trying to live up to a version of himself that the world had created. But now, as the haze began to clear, Ajani realized that he had the power to write his own story. For the first time, Ajani felt a sense of freedom, not just in his music, but in his life. A few days later, Ajani sat down with Sarah, his manager, to discuss the future of his career. They'd had their fair share of difficult conversations, but this one felt different. It wasn't about marketing strategies, album sales, or tour dates, it was about his personal journey, his creative process, and what he wanted next. "I've been thinking a lot about where I want to go from here," Ajani said, his voice steady. "And I've realized that I can't keep doing things the way I've been doing them. I don't want to be just another star who's only about the numbers. I want my music to mean something again, something real." Sarah listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. "What are you thinking?" Ajani took a deep breath, then looked her in the eyes. "I want to take a break. Not just from the spotlight, but from everything, the shows, the press, the constant grind. I want to go back to creating for the sake of creating. I want to find the joy in it again, not the pressure. I want to give myself the space to grow, to change, without feeling like I'm losing everything I've built." Sarah paused for a moment, considering his words. "I understand," she said slowly. "And I think you're right. This is your journey, Ajani. We've spent so long building up this image, this brand, but at the end of the day, it's your happiness and authenticity that matter most. You need to do what feels right for you. But if you do take a break, it's important that we communicate that clearly to your fans, your team. You don't want them to think that you're disappearing. You just need some time to figure things out." Ajani nodded. "Yeah, exactly. I don't want to disappear. I just need to step back and breathe. And when I'm ready, I'll come back, stronger. But only if it's on my terms." Sarah smiled, her expression full of understanding. I've got your back, Johnny. Always. It didn't take long for Johnny to announce his decision publicly. He posted a heartfelt message on social media, explaining his need for a break, for a chance to reconnect with his roots, and for a period of reflection. The response from his fans was overwhelmingly supportive. Many expressed gratitude for his honesty, and they promised to wait for him, knowing that when he returned, it would be with music that was true to who he was. Still, there were some critics. Some questioned if Johnny was just a fleeting star, someone who couldn't handle the pressures of fame. Others wondered if he would fade into obscurity, like so many before him. But Johnny was no longer concerned with those voices. He had reached a point where he realized that the only opinion that truly mattered was his own. The next few months were a period of deep reflection for Johnny. He spent time in nature, walking through the woods near his home, letting the quietness wash over him. He read books, meditated, and sometimes just sat in silence, trying to get in touch with the part of himself that had always been overshadowed by the demands of the world. During this time, he also revisited his old music, the songs he had written before the fame, before the pressure, before everything became about being someone he wasn't. As he listened to those early tracks, he could feel the purity of his passion, the raw emotion that had driven him to play in the first place. He picked up his guitar again, and the music flowed like it hadn't in a long time. The songs came more easily, more naturally, as though the walls that had been built around him had finally come down. One afternoon, as Johnny sat in his studio, surrounded by a few familiar faces, Jackson, Sarah, and his closest friends, he played a new song for them. It was unlike anything he had ever written before, stripped down, soulful, and completely genuine. When the last note faded, there was a long silence. Finally, Jackson spoke. "That's amazing. It's raw. It's real." Johnny smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "I feel like I'm finally writing the music I've always wanted to create. It's not about the fame, or the labels, or the audience. It's just music. And that's enough." Sarah, too, looked proud. "This is the direction you were always meant to go in, Johnny. You're finally doing it for the right reasons." Johnny looked around at his friends and smiled, feeling like he had finally found his way. He wasn't just a musician anymore, he was a person, a creator, someone who had reclaimed his authenticity and found peace in it. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready for whatever came next. The months that followed Johnny's decision to step away from the spotlight were a time of deep self-reflection and growth. He had learned to embrace solitude, to cherish the quiet moments that allowed him to hear the music of his own heart without the noise of the world intruding. He wrote more songs than he had in years, each one a piece of himself, a raw expression of the emotions that had once been buried beneath the weight of expectations. There were still moments of doubt, of course. On nights when the silence of his studio seemed overwhelming, when the absence of the fans' cheers left him feeling a bit lost, Johnny would question whether he was doing the right thing. But then he would pick up his guitar, and everything would fall into place. His fingers would find the strings, and the music would begin to speak to him, reminding him why he started this journey in the first place. One day, as Johnny sat in his studio working on a new track, his phone buzzed with a message from Jackson. It was simple, just one line: "We've got a big offer for you." Johnny raised an eyebrow. He hadn't been expecting anything from the industry while he was on his break. But Jackson was always up to something, and curiosity got the better of him. He quickly typed a reply, "What kind of offer?" The response came swiftly. "A record label wants to meet with you. They're interested in your new music, and they want to see where you're headed next." Johnny's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. The offer wasn't unexpected, in fact, he had known that his music had been gaining attention. But the idea of returning to the industry, even on his own terms, brought with it a surge of mixed emotions. He had spent so long distancing himself from that world, and now here it was, calling him back. He took a deep breath, then typed back, "Let's set it up." The day of the meeting, Ajani walked into the record label's sleek downtown office with a mix of excitement and trepidation. It had been months since he'd sat in a room like this, surrounded by people who viewed him as a commodity, a product to be sold. But this time, he was different. He wasn't the star they had once built up. He was Ajani, the artist, the musician who had rediscovered his soul and was no longer willing to compromise it for the sake of fame. He was met by two executives, a woman named Vanessa and a man named Sam, who both greeted him with wide smiles. "Ajani," Vanessa said, extending her hand. "It's so good to finally meet you in person. We've been following your new music, and we have to say, we're really impressed. Your sound has evolved in such an authentic way." Ajani shook her hand, nodding. "Thanks. I've been working on it, trying to find something that feels true to who I am now." Sam, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We've been watching your journey, Ajani. Your new music has sparked a lot of excitement. We'd love to work with you and see how we can help bring this new chapter of your career to a larger audience." Ajani listened intently, the words both tempting and challenging. It was everything he had worked toward, everything he had once dreamed of. But this time, he knew he had to make sure that any deal he entered into would honor the artist he had become, not the one the world had tried to make him. "I appreciate the offer," Ajani said after a long pause. "But I'm not looking for the same thing I was before. I'm not interested in just putting out music that fits the mold of what people expect. I want to make something that's real, something that comes from my heart." Vanessa and Sam exchanged glances, surprised by his candor but intrigued by his confidence. "We're not asking you to conform, Ajani," Vanessa replied. "We see your potential, and we believe in the direction you're headed. This could be an opportunity for you to reach even more people with the kind of music you want to make. We want to support you, not change you." Ajani studied their faces, searching for any signs of insincerity. What he saw was a genuine openness, a willingness to give him the freedom he needed to create. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't being sold something. He was being offered a partnership, one where his voice, his vision, would still be the driving force. "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Let's talk." In the weeks that followed, Ajani worked closely with the label, but always on his terms. He set clear boundaries, ensuring that his music would remain authentic to his journey and his growth. The label listened, offering guidance without pushing him to conform to trends. They were impressed by his vision and his newfound clarity, and Ajani felt the weight of the past few years slowly lifting off his shoulders. He was no longer fighting against the system, he was working with it, using his platform to speak his truth. His music began to evolve even more as he experimented with different sounds, blending genres, and pushing his creative limits. The collaboration with the label opened doors to talented producers and musicians, and soon, Ajani found himself in the studio every day, working on a new album that would reflect everything he had learned during his time away from the spotlight. But it wasn't just about the music. This time, Ajani wanted to make a difference. He wanted his music to inspire, to empower, to show others that it was okay to break free from the expectations placed upon them. He was no longer just an artist, he was a storyteller, a voice for those who felt unheard. One evening, after a long day of recording, Ajani sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city. He had come a long way from the young boy who had first picked up a guitar. He had faced countless struggles, been knocked down more times than he could count, but he had never stopped getting back up. And now, as he looked back on his journey, he realized that the struggles had been worth it. He had found his voice. He had found his truth. And most importantly, he had found the courage to be himself, no matter the cost. As he strummed his guitar softly, the city lights twinkling below him, Ajani knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had learned to trust himself, and that was all he needed. The world was waiting for the new Ajani, the real Ajani. And he was ready to show them who he truly was. It had been months since Ajani made the decision to take control of his future. He had turned down offers that no longer aligned with his vision and accepted only those that could genuinely support his creative freedom. Now, as he stood on the stage before thousands of fans, with a new album ready to be revealed to the world, he was filled with a sense of peace and excitement he had never known before. The night before his first concert since his hiatus, Ajani couldn't sleep. He sat in his hotel room, staring at the reflection in the window as the city lights flickered below. This was it. The moment he had been working for, the moment he was going to share his new sound with the world, fully aware and fully himself. Tomorrow's the big day, huh? Jackson said, his voice cutting through the silence as he stepped into the room. Ajani looked up, meeting his best friend's eyes. Jackson had been there through it all, and tonight, as always, he was by Ajani's side, ready for whatever came next. Ajani nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. It feels different this time. Not just because I'm coming back to the stage after everything, but because I feel like I'm finally ready to show people who I really am. Not who they think I should be. Jackson smiled, settling into a chair across from Ajani. You've always been you, even when you were hiding behind someone else's image. But now you're doing it your way, on your terms. That's what matters. Ajani took a deep breath, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. He had made so many sacrifices to get to this point, losing himself, finding himself, stepping back, then stepping forward, but in the end, it had all been worth it. He wasn't just coming back to perform, he was coming back to share his truth with the world. And that was everything. The next day, the anticipation in the air was palpable. The venue was packed, the crowd buzzing with excitement for the first live performance of Ajani's new music. The lights dimmed, and the murmurs of the audience grew louder until it was nearly deafening. When the first notes of the opening song echoed through the speakers, the crowd went wild. Ajani stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had spent so long questioning himself, wondering if he was good enough, if the world would accept the music he had poured so much of his soul into. But now, in this very moment, none of that mattered. As the band began to play, Ajani stepped into the spotlight. The roar of the crowd sent a surge of energy through his veins. The music flowed from him effortlessly, each note more powerful than the last. He sang with everything he had, not caring about perfection or about pleasing anyone. He was no longer the boy trying to prove himself, he was an artist, and this was his stage, his story. Every song he played was a piece of him, a piece of his journey, a journey of pain, of growth, of triumph. The lyrics spoke of everything he had learned during his time away from the spotlight. The value of staying true to yourself, the power of resilience, the importance of love and connection. And as he looked out into the sea of faces, he saw the tears, the smiles, the energy of the crowd, and he knew, this was why he had done it. This was the connection he had been searching for. His music wasn't just for him anymore, it was for everyone who had ever felt lost, who had ever felt like they didn't belong, who had ever felt like they had to hide who they were. As the final notes of the last song echoed in the arena, Ajani stood there, breathless and overcome with emotion. The applause that followed was deafening, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel overwhelmed by the sound. He felt embraced by it, as if the world itself was welcoming him back, not as a star, not as a product, but as Ajani. The months that followed the concert were nothing short of transformative. Ajani's new album, Rebirth, was released to critical acclaim. It wasn't just the music that resonated with people, it was the honesty and vulnerability behind it. Fans and critics alike recognized that Ajani had come back not as a commercial product but as an artist with a story to tell. His music was a reflection of his journey, his struggles, his victories. The success of the album wasn't measured by sales alone. It was the message behind it, the idea that people didn't have to conform to the world's expectations to find success or happiness. They could live authentically, embrace their truth, and create their own path, just like Ajani had done. Through it all, Jackson remained his closest confidant, and Sarah, who had always believed in Ajani's authenticity, was there every step of the way. They had witnessed his evolution, and now, they were seeing the fruits of his labor. Ajani wasn't just making music anymore, he was changing the way people saw themselves and the world around them. And then came the news that would change everything. It was a quiet evening when the call came. Ajani was sitting at his piano, lost in the melody of a new idea, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Ajani," the voice on the other end said. "This is Lauren from the Grammy Awards." Ajani's heart skipped a beat. The Grammy Awards. He had never expected to hear from them. They had been an aspiration, a dream he had once thought unattainable, but now it seemed within reach. "We've been following your journey, your new music, and we're impressed by the depth and authenticity of your work. We'd like to formally invite you to perform at this year's Grammy ceremony." Ajani felt the weight of the moment settle in. He had come so far, from the young boy mocked by a guitar legend to the artist whose music now resonated with millions. This invitation wasn't just recognition, it was a testament to everything he had fought for, everything he had overcome. He took a deep breath, a smile tugging at his lips. "I'd be honored." The night of the Grammy Awards arrived, and Ajani found himself standing backstage, staring at the glowing stage in front of him. It felt surreal. The same stage that had once seemed so far out of reach was now his to command. The same world that had once dismissed him was now waiting to hear his voice. When his name was called, Ajani walked onto the stage, his heart racing with excitement and gratitude. As he stood before the crowd, he knew this was the culmination of everything, the pain, the struggles, the sacrifices. It was all worth it. And as the music began, Ajani sang, not for the trophies, not for the fame, but for himself. For the journey that had brought him here. For the boy who had once been lost, and for the man who had found his way. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for the performance, it was for the person Ajani had become, a creator, a survivor, a trailblazer. The day after the Grammys, Ajani sat in his hotel room, staring at the trophy sitting on the desk in front of him. It gleamed in the soft light of the afternoon, a symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. But as he sat there, still feeling the weight of the applause from the night before echoing in his mind, he realized something: the trophy didn't define him. What defined him was the journey, the struggles he had overcome, the people who had believed in him, and the lessons he had learned along the way. The standing ovation had been incredible, but the real reward was the peace he felt inside, knowing that he had stayed true to himself and had made music that resonated with the world. He picked up the Grammy, his fingers brushing the smooth surface. It was beautiful, no doubt, but in that moment, it felt almost incidental. What mattered more was the connection he had forged with his audience, the way his music had touched lives, the way his story had inspired others to stand up and be themselves. He had done something bigger than win awards, he had sparked a movement. As the tour continued, Ajani's performances grew more dynamic, more electrifying. Each show felt like a reunion with his fans, an exchange of energy and emotion that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. People didn't just come to see him perform, they came to witness the journey of a man who had poured his soul into his art, who had faced down his demons and come out the other side stronger. One evening, after a particularly moving show in New York, Ajani sat alone in his dressing room, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Are you okay? I've been thinking about you." Ajani smiled, the warmth of her words comforting him as always. Sarah had been a constant support in his life, and their friendship had deepened over the years. She understood him in ways that no one else did, and he had come to rely on her wisdom and guidance. He quickly typed back, "I'm good, just taking it all in. A lot has changed, huh?" A moment later, her reply came, "You've changed. In the best way possible. But you're still the same Ajani I met all those years ago, just with a lot more of yourself to share with the world." Ajani felt a lump form in his throat as he read her words. She was right. He had changed, but in a way that felt right. He had become the person he was always meant to be. His success didn't just come from the Grammy or the chart-topping albums, it came from the quiet moments of reflection, from understanding what really mattered, from embracing his identity as a black artist in a world that often tried to define him for him. The next morning, Ajani sat in a cafe with Jackson, talking about the next steps in his career. The conversation had shifted from music to life itself. Ajani had learned that balance was key to everything: success, happiness, peace. And it wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about living fully in all aspects of life. "What's next for you, man?" Jackson asked, his voice casual but tinged with curiosity. Ajani leaned back in his chair, watching the sunlight filter through the cafe windows. It was a peaceful moment, one of many he had learned to appreciate since stepping back from the chaotic whirlwind of fame. The answer came to him easily. "I think I'm ready to start writing for others. I've been through so much, and I have so many stories to tell. I want to share those with the world, not just through my music, but through helping other artists find their own voice." Jackson nodded, a grin forming on his face. "I knew you were going to say something like that. You've always been about more than just yourself. You were made for this." Ajani laughed, feeling a sense of contentment that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't just a musician anymore, he was a mentor, a guide, someone who could inspire others to take their own journey toward authenticity. "I think it's time to pass the torch, you know," Ajani said, his voice thoughtful. "It's about giving back, about helping other people find their voice. I've learned a lot, and I want to help others learn too. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself." As the tour wrapped up and Ajani began to shift his focus toward producing for other artists, he found a sense of fulfillment that was even greater than performing. Helping young artists shape their sound, watching them find their own identity and voice in a world that often sought to silence them, it was deeply rewarding. Ajani started mentoring up-and-coming musicians, especially black artists who were navigating the complexities of the music industry. He shared his story with them, not just the successes but the struggles, the obstacles that had made him who he was. He told them about the importance of staying true to themselves, about the need to create music that came from their hearts, not from the expectations of others. The more he worked with these artists, the more Ajani realized how much he had to offer. His influence wasn't just in his music, it was in the way he helped others see the value of their own stories, their own truths. The lessons he had learned about overcoming doubt, about pushing through adversity, about finding peace in authenticity, those lessons were what he wanted to pass on. As the years went by, Ajani became known not just as a successful artist but as a mentor and advocate for authenticity in music. His legacy was no longer defined by record sales or awards, it was defined by the impact he had on the people around him, the artists he mentored, the fans whose lives he touched, and the young black musicians who saw him as a beacon of hope in an industry that often tried to shape them into something they were not. Ajani had come full circle. The boy who had been mocked and dismissed, the teenager who had been forced to grow up too quickly, the artist who had almost lost himself in the pursuit of fame, he had found his way back. He had found peace. He had found his voice. And he had helped others do the same. The world knew Ajani not just for his Grammy wins, not just for his chart-topping hits, but for the way he had shaped the future of music. He had used his platform to inspire, to uplift, and to show others that their stories, no matter how different, were worth sharing. And in doing so, he had made the world a little bit better, one song, one mentor, and one truth at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?